Computer. Okay, there we go. Good afternoon and welcome to this event as part of the book fair at CAA 2021, in which we are hosted by Bloomsbury Academic Books. And we're here to discuss a number of publications in a series called New Encounters. I am the series editor, Griselda Pollock, and we are going to introduce that now. Now, I'm going to talk about the series in general, and today we have three of the authors who will be present to talk about the latest books. Now, New Encounters, Arts, Cultures and Concepts is a series of books that have been published in the last 10, 12 years, and they take different forms. Some, as you can see at the top, are edited collections. So we have Conceptual Odysseys, Passages to Cultural Analysis, The Sacred and the Feminine, Imagination and Sexual Difference, Bluebeard's Legacy, Death and Secrets from Bartok to Hitchcock, Digital and Other Virtualities, Renegotiating the Image, and Visual Politics of Psychoanalysis, Art and the Image in Post-Traumatic Cultures. So you can see that these are books which have topics, themes, which will be played out across the visual arts, cinema, in some cases literature, in some cases theory, and that if you look at some of the images, you can see Trinity Minha's film in terms of digital and other virtualities, Night Passage on the cover. On the cover of Visual Politics is a scene from Alfredo Jar's Rwanda. So it's an interdisciplinary project based on encounters. We also have monographs, and this monograph, Helen Frankenthaler, Painting History, Writing, Painting, an exploration of the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 2000s, major American painter. Vanessa Corby writing on Eva Hesse, Longing, Belonging, and Displacement, and Nicholas Scher on Auschwitz and After Images, Abjection, Witnessing, and Representation. So these are single-authored books. And our latest, which we're going to talk about later, by Elizabeth Bronfen, Cross Mappings, edited by Gil Pasternak, Visioning Israel-Palestine, Imagining Culture Beyond the Conflicts of the Boundaries of Conflict, and Isabelle de la Cour, Post-Traumatic Art in the City Between War and Cultural Memory in Sarajevo and Beirut. We also have a mini-series, a sort of sub-series within New Encounters called Concentrationary Memories, The Politics of Representation, and there are 2 volumes within that. So let me just explain the origins of this series and why it's important. We subtitle it Transdisciplinary Cultural Analysis with Disciplinary Lenses. There was a period where interdisciplinarity was the key thing, but we felt that there were bigger questions to be posed around the notion of how we study visual art, particularly as I was an art historian, what is happening to art history. But there'd been expansion of a field called visual culture that displaced the historical to focus more on the issues of the function of the image and drawing a different series of theoretical propositions. Then obviously there is cultural studies, a much broader area, and the emergence of a form of practice called cultural analysis. What is the relations between all of these and their relationship between art, art history, visual studies, and also what was going on after a very rich period of theoretical expansion and development in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Are we in a post-theoretical era? What do we do with this rich intellectual revolution that took place from structuralism through to postmodernism and in psychoanalysis, literary theory, philosophy, and in the actual practices of the visual arts? What are the new directions? And the question, to what should we remain loyal? So New Encounters put together arts, cultures, concepts to propose some ways of thinking through these questions that seemed very urgent in the beginning of the 21st century. The first thing we did was to create transdisciplinary initiative, which does not mean that everybody's being interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary, but that there is a bringing together of different ways of thinking that create the notion of research that happens through transdisciplinary encounter. Now, how does that work? So when we bring together transdisciplinary and encounter, we mark the interaction between specific disciplinary and theoretically aligned ways of thinking, doing, and making in the arts and humanities. They have different protocols, they have different priorities. Each produces a useful way of thinking, but also they can challenge each other when they come together because they retain their distinctive features of the disciplinary practices. And yet new knowledge is produced when these different ways of doing thinking and making encounter each other across concepts, concepts that can circulate between these different sites in order to be looked at, as it were, in a prism that changes the facet or aspect of the concept as it looked at through specific practices. So concepts circulate between different intellectual or aesthetic discourses and cultures. They inflect them, they share common questions, but they may approach them in distinctly articulated practices, which we still need to be precise in the way that we analyze them. So the aim is to place these different practices in productive encounter with each other, mediated by the circulation of shared concepts. So our first book was called Conceptual Odysseys, Passages to Cultural Analysis. And it was a conversation in part with the person who articulated a concept of cultural analysis that falls between and transcends literary theories, biblical studies, psychoanalysis, art history, which is Mika Bal. And she wrote a book called Traveling Concepts in the Humanities at the beginning of the 21st century, in which she drew attention to a shift from massive theoretical alignments, are you a structuralist, a Foucauldian, a Marxist, a Lacanian, these kinds of orders of theoretical thinking, and said all of this creativity in the intellectual dynamics of the humanities at the end of the 21st century had generated a range of concepts which can move from the site of their origin. For instance, frame originates in art history, but it become a concept that can be used in a series of other sites of the arts and humanities. And this excited me greatly because I suddenly thought, yes, this is the legacy of a certain kind of dedicated theoretical interventions. Now we have these concepts which can travel and become form part of what she was going to call a practice of cultural analysis, which did not find itself tide bound by saying, okay, art history has to be historical, and visual culture doesn't concern itself with history or aesthetics, and cultural studies doesn't actually specify particular notions of the visual or arts. It deals more with life processes and cultural practices. So we had these rich diversions, but what happens when we find concepts coming from each of them and traveling across them? So the first book, as you can see, is about working with concepts where things like framing, agency, the mirror, trauma, life mapping, puncture, punctum, history, nostalgia, pedagogy, efficacity, commitment. This is not thinking in terms of a study of a particular literary work or an artistic work or a theory. It's concept-led. And so these books that are the edited collections have in common a very wide range of topics and a wide range of media, but they are brought together and examined by different scholars working through the questions posed by, for instance, Death and Secrets from Bartok to Hitchcock, the legacies of male violence as seen through the figure of Bluebeard. How does this work out? How does it occur? How does it transform itself so that you don't even realize you're watching a Bluebeard movie or reading a Bluebeard book? It doesn't advertise itself, but we draw out from it the continuities and repetitions and transformations. The sacred and feminine imagination and sexual difference. This was picking up on Kristeva and Catherine Clément's idea of the feminine and the sacred. This question about the fold, as she calls it, between life and meaning, between the body and the sign, and how sexual difference, the question of sexuality, but also the question of masculinity, femininities intersect with that at the level of the different scales at which this is imagined, whether it's in art or theology or in literature. And the visual politics of psychoanalysis was particularly concerned with the ideas of the different ways that the psychoanalytical feeds into the practices of image making, and particularly the practices of reading, studying, analyzing, and working with and creating images. The monographs enable a deep study of a particular topic, perhaps more, Helen Frank, more conventionally in terms of art history, and Auschwitz and after images. The key question was, what are the terms of which he's arguing abjection, witnessing, and representation when we deal with something of the scale and challenge of the trauma of the events that are associated with Auschwitz. And finally, the concentrationary memories, the politics of representation, is a series of studies in which the key concept is the concentrationary, but takes up the concept of memory studies, and also the question of the unconscious, the persistent, the kind of what one could call kind of the political unconscious or the political imaginary of societies which witnessed in the 20th century the invention of totalitarianism and in fascism, and the enactment of it, and it questions its legacy. So that gives you an overview of the series in which we're now going to talk about three very, very important new publications which we are launching with this project. And I'm now going to hand over to my first speaker, who is Elizabeth Bronfen. Oh, sorry. These are our publications. And so Elizabeth Bronfen is going to talk about cross mappings.
Thank you, Griselda, for also making this publication possible in your series. What the book Cross Mapping does is bring together a set of essays that document my work in visual culture in the past 20 years or so. And many of the essays in the book Cross Mapping are the result of conversations that I've had with artists who were interested in my work because they knew Over a Dead Body and were interested in the relationship between femininity and death, or they knew the book The Knotted Subject and were interested in questions of hysteria, or these essays were the result of talking with curators who were putting together shows related to issues that they thought that I could address. And the two points of focus in all of these essays really are, on the one hand, a feminist gaze on women artists. That is to say, what does it mean to look at artists who are concerned with feminist issues, or what does it mean to give a specifically feminist reading of a set of artworks? And this obviously has to do with depiction of women, but also just questions of gender. And the second important approach that I take in these articles is that, of course, I come to visual culture as someone who started out in literary studies. That is to say, I'm interested in reading images and reading them through theory, through theoretical concepts, to pick up on a point, Griselda, that you made earlier. And the concepts and the theoretical questions that I'm particularly interested in are those having to do with psychoanalysis and semiotics. And when I say I'm interested in the kind of the way that a psychoanalytic and feminist approach to these artworks is important to me, then it's usually in relationship to not what we see in the image, but things that have to do with that elude the image, because my focus is on something which within psychoanalysis we would delegate to the realm of the real, which is to say how the real is negotiated through the imaginary, obviously also in relationship to symbolic codes, but how do we think and conceptualize and visualize death, trauma, pain, the ecstatic, or even in one of the books that I was also interested in, The Night. So it's always, for me, a question of how something is contained in the double sense of the word. That is to say, an aesthetic formalization preserves something, an intensity, and at the same time delimits it in such a way that in fact it can be formulated, it can be articulated, it can be recycled, and it can be renegotiated. Now, the title cross mappings is a concept that I have coined, and I've coined it in conversation with several theorists. The perhaps most important of them, and also I know very much an inspiration for Griselda Pollock's work, also in this series, is Abi Warburg and Abi Warburg's work on pathos formula, that is to say on the aesthetic formulas that, as I've already said, contain intensities or energies, that both preserve them but also delimit them in order for them to have what Warburg called a Nachleben. This is a form of cultural persistence, a kind of cultural sustainability, one could say, and also kind of cultural afterlife. So it's the formalization which initially it made the intensity into something that could be articulated, that could be visualized, that could be narrated. And what subsequent recyclings pick up on is, on the most obvious level, the formalization, but by recycling, appropriating, refiguring this formalization, what is also transmitted is this intensity. And it is that play together of intensity and form that I'm particularly interested in most of these articles, because I try to do something very similar to what Warburg does with his Mnemosyne Atlas, which is to say he, of course, is only interested in certain visual gestures, and then he takes many examples and places them on his blackboards. But the important point was not just that he would collect all these different images, for example, of a nymph and the movement of her foot, but that he would bring into conversation on these blackboards images from from antiquity, from 18th century painting, but also very contemporary, for him, contemporary images from advertisement. The important point for me here isn't the actual content of these atlases that he produces, but rather the idea of thinking in associations, that is to say, a kind of montage technique, thinking in series and in serialities, to see when I place images or texts next to each other, what then do I notice that I wouldn't have noticed otherwise? So this idea of the formalization of intensities and then looking at a sequence of them is one of the things that cross-mapping does by mapping various texts onto each other. The second theorist, and we've already heard Nick about, that is important for my thinking is her work on what she calls preposterous history, where basically in her work she looks at Caravaggio and the way that we can rethink Caravaggio in relationship to artists who have subsequently recycled him. But I take from her this idea of a preposterous gaze, looking at something prior through the lens of something that came afterwards. And this is what I do in many of these pieces, and this in a sense is the kind of cross I'm interested in, looking at a, let's say, contemporary television show in relationship to a Shakespeare play. So the cross is both a cross historical one, namely between contemporary moment, early 20th century, and the early modern period, but it is also cross in the sense of cross media or transmedia, moving from play to television drama. And the third theorist that I would just want to bring into play is someone whom I feel myself in conversation as well, is the American philosopher Stanley Cavell, who in fact was one of the first people to suggest that it may be worthwhile thinking through the kind of problems of skepticism that he's interested in relationship to Shakespeare by looking at similar problems that are raised, not explicitly, of course, but implicitly in a set of films that he was particularly interested in, namely Hollywood comedies of the 30s and 40s that he called the comedies of remarriage. And again, it's not the texts themselves that he's using, but the process that he suggests, namely that you look at texts, bring them in conversations with each other because they have common themes, they have common constellations and concerns, not in relationship to intention or influence, but rather once you've discovered an analogy, much like Warburg is interested in coming up with a series of images based on a common formalization. Once you've discovered this analogy, what does that then mean for an individual reading? So again, it's the question of persistence that I'm interested in. Something persists over generations, over centuries, and finds a re-articulation. And again, what I would be interested in these cross mappings is not just to map a prior text onto a later text and say there are similar concerns that keep resurfacing at certain historical moments, even if in different media. But what I'm then also interested in, what changes? What is different when a certain set of concerns that we can find in queenship in Shakespeare, for example, is picked up again in American television drama about the first female president? And why is it important that something has changed, not just that something has persisted? So the cross and cross mappings is taken in part from the notion of cross-dressing, because I'm always interested in gender appropriations and how certain issues of gender can be refigured and rewritten. It is also, of course, the crossover between high and low culture, or a crossover between different media, from drama or literature through opera to film or photography. And important for cross also for me is this oscillating gaze, because as I say, I'm interested in the real. So it's the transformation of the body into sign, or into that which is ungraspable, like trauma or death, into a sign, and how things like violence, pain, or affects can be formalized, can be transmitted, how they are part and parcel of fantasy work, what aesthetic practices are able to expose, but also what in the process of exposing or articulating, what do they then hide? And part and parcel of that, and this I think has very much to do with the question of gender as well, is when do we avert our gaze because we do not want to see, for example, as Cavell would put it, the otherness of the other, because we do not want to see sexual difference. And what does it mean not to overlook? What does it mean to look differently? So not overlooking, looking differently is in a sense what I try to do in many of these articles. And just briefly to say why the two parts. In the first part, picking up on Mika Baal's notion of traveling concepts, I speak about traveling image formula. And here I'm interested in representations of women, how the notion of portraiture, the nude, or the tableau vivant finds a kind of cultural legacy, how it is revisited, or what it means for us to revisit that archive, to look at how artists refigure this tradition, or how we in our readings of this tradition might rethink it. But this also includes a relationship between pop culture and high art, especially in an article which I called Hitler Goes Pop, where I was interested in taking the notion of fascist aesthetics from Susan Sontag and looking at the way cinema worked with that in order to distinguish between a filmmaker like Riefenstahl and the body choreography that we find in the Busby Berkeley musicals that one likes to see in relationship to fascist art or fascist aesthetics. But that does something very different once we look at distinctly how the bodies and the body formations work. And in a similar vein, you can then bring Disney in here as well. And as I've already mentioned, another kind of a crossover that I'm interested in as something that travels is the notion of Shakespearean drama as it resurfaces in contemporary television drama, most notably in the article that I have here on The Wire, and how it thinks back the 4 plays that Shakespeare wrote about the War of the Roses. And the second part, which I've called Gendering the Uncanny, Imaging Death, really looks at various aspects of how death and mortality, the trauma of the fragility of life has been formalized, especially also in relationship to gender. So it's not just the way gender for Freud is from the start an uncanny category, because the masculine and the feminine are not easily delineated, but also how various artists have interrogated and negotiated what is a cultural commonplace for us, namely the alignment between the feminine and fragility or vulnerability or death. And here the artists I particularly focus on are artists like Cindy Sherman, Eva Hesse, Elisha Attila, and Louise Bourgeois. But I'm also interested in a kind of appropriation of the feminine by artists, particularly Duchamp and Picasso, along, of course, with the way that Freud himself appropriates the feminine for his psychoanalytic thinking. So in general, and this is how the notion both of thinking through encounters in relationship to concepts comes into play. It's really, essays are really about revisiting an archive and looking at things differently, and thinking of cross-mapping not as something that the artworks give us, but something that we do so that it becomes an operative practice. That is to say, by virtue of coming up with analogies, mapping texts onto each other, coming up with sequences, seeing both how certain concerns have a kind of cultural persistence, but also how we can look at them against the grain. And this often means either discovering or redefining a lineage. Thus also the question what we want to continue to be loyal to, and ask ourselves why at certain historic moments, certain concerns, and thus also certain artworks and films have meaning again, so that overall what I'm proposing with cross mappings is really a kind of creative reading, that is to say, producing these maps that are heuristically valuable. And that also means, and this is something I take both from Freud and from Warburg, that this is a work in progress, that you can keep realigning the maps, adding to the maps, changing the maps, depending on what further material is brought into play.
Thank you, Elizabeth, so very much for that beautiful account of the book and the underpinning of it. We will now move on to the second speaker, who is Isabelle Delacour, who is going to talk about her concept, which is the post-traumatic city.